History is full of countless tales of horror, mystery, and the unknown. Some events are so terrifying that they have become legends that chill us to the bone. Join me as we explore 5 terrifying historical events that will blow your mind. Subscribe to the channel by clicking like before the video starts. The rape of Nanking, a city of great historical importance in the heart of China, was about to become an unspeakable horror. Nanking, the former capital of the Republic of China, was on the brink of a tragedy that would change human history forever. The year was 1937. The Second Sino-Japanese War had been going on for several months. The Japanese Imperial Army, driven by a desire for expansion and a sense of racial superiority, quickly entered Chinese territory. Nanking, a city of immense cultural and historical significance, was their next target. As the Japanese troops approached Nanking, the city's civilians were terrified. Many escaped, but countless others were trapped. Desperate to defend the city, the Chinese government hastily organized defense forces, but they were too numerous and unarmed. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese army entered Nanking. The first days were full of fierce fighting, but the Chinese defenders were eventually defeated. The city fell into Japanese hands. What followed was a period of unimaginable horror. Driven by a combination of brutality, lust, and a belief in their own racial superiority, the Japanese soldiers began a reign of terror in the city. The rape of Nanking, as it turned out, was a systematic campaign of violence and brutality. Women of all ages have experienced horrific sexual abuse. 7-year-old girls were raped. Men were tortured, mutilated, and executed. Japanese soldiers committed unspeakable atrocities. They carried out mass executions, often in the most gruesome manner imaginable. Dead bodies piled up and the rivers were stained with blood. The scale of the sexual abuse was staggering. It is estimated that tens of thousands of women and girls, from infants to elderly women, were raped. Out of a sense of superiority and a desire to dominate, the Japanese treated Nanking women as objects of their lust. The rapes were often brutal and prolonged. Women were gang-raped, tortured, and injured. Some were forced to engage in serious sexual violence against family members. Others were killed after being raped, and their bodies left to rot in the streets. Nanking rape victims came from all walks of life. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, and wives. Some were students and others were professionals. Many were forced to leave their homes. Only Japanese soldiers were captured and raped. Japanese soldiers often targeted women in their own homes. They broke down doors, dragged women away from their families, and raped them in front of their husbands, children, and parents. The injuries to these victims were very great. Some women were forced to serve as comfort women, a euphemism for effective prostitution. These women were repeatedly sexually assaulted, often in brothels run by the Japanese military. They were treated as property without any rights or value. The rape of Nanking was not a special feature. This was a deliberate policy by the Japanese military. Soldiers were encouraged to commit violence against the Chinese population, and there was little or no judicial accountability for crimes. Those who survived the rape of Nanking suffered for a lifetime. Many struggled with physical and mental illness. Some of their own communities were ostracized, unable to find other jobs or lead normal lives. Today, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall stands as a witness to the horrors of those dark days. The museum contains countless artifacts, including personal belongings, photographs, and testimonies of the victims. Walking through the memorial halls is a thrilling experience. The exhibits are vivid reminders of the human costs of war and the importance of remembering the past. The rape of Nanking was a crime against humanity. The Japanese government has acknowledged the atrocities committed by its soldiers, but the full extent of the violence remains a mystery. The legacy of the rape of Nanking is complex. It has had a profound impact on the relationship between China and Japan, and it continues to shape the way that people around the world view war and violence. The rape of Nanking is a dark chapter in human history. It is a story of unimaginable suffering, of the depths to which humanity can sink. By remembering this tragedy, we can strive to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. The Rwandan genocide. Narrator. In the heart of Africa, a nation torn apart by ethnic divisions was about to descend into a nightmare. Rwanda, a small, landlocked country, was on the brink of a genocide that would shock the world. for centuries, Rwanda had been home to two distinct ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. While the two groups were often intertwined, there were subtle differences in their cultural practices and social hierarchies. Over time, these differences evolved into a system of ethnic stratification, with the Tutsi minority holding disproportionate power and wealth. This social inequality fueled resentment among the Hutu majority. In 1990, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, a Tutsi rebel group, launched an invasion of Rwanda from neighboring Uganda. The RPF was seeking to overthrow the Hutu-dominated government and establish a more inclusive political system. The war was marked by intense fighting and widespread atrocities. Both sides committed acts of violence against civilians. However, the Hutu government, fearing the loss of power, began to incite ethnic hatred against the Tutsi minority. On April 6, 1994, the Rwandan president, Juvenal Habyarimana, a Hutu, was assassinated. This event sparked a wave of violence that quickly escalated into a full-scale genocide. Hutu extremists, organized into militias known as the Interahamwe, began targeting Tutsi civilians. They were joined by ordinary Hutu citizens who had been indoctrinated to believe that Tutsi were responsible for Rwanda's problems. The genocide was carried out with a calculated brutality. Tutsi were hunted down in their homes, churches, and schools. They were hacked to death with machetes, beaten with clubs, and thrown into mass graves. The violence spread rapidly throughout the country. Entire villages were wiped out, and the bodies of victims were left to rot in the streets. The genocide was carried out with such efficiency that it shocked the world. The international community was slow to respond to the genocide. The United Nations peacekeeping force in Rwanda was underfunded and undermanned, and it was unable to prevent the violence. The international response was further hampered by political divisions and bureaucratic delays. It was not until the genocide was well underway that the UN Security Council authorized a military intervention. The Rwandan genocide lasted for approximately 100 days. By the time it was over, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people had been killed. The genocide had a devastating impact on Rwandan society. The Rwandan government has since made significant strides in rebuilding the country. However, the scars of the genocide continue to be felt. Many Rwandans have been left traumatized by their experiences. The Rwandan genocide is a dark chapter in human history. It is a reminder of the horrors that can be perpetrated when ethnic hatred and violence are allowed to spiral out of control. The Great Irish Famine. In the mid-19th century, a small island nation off the coast of Europe was ravaged by a catastrophe that would forever change its course. The Great Irish Famine, a period of widespread starvation and death, left an indelible mark on the history of Ireland. The famine was primarily caused by a blight that destroyed potato crops, the staple food of the Irish people. This simple, yet devastating, event had far-reaching consequences. The potato, introduced to Ireland in the 16th century, had become a vital part of the country's economy and culture. The crop was easy to grow and provided a cheap and nutritious source of food for the vast majority of the population. Ireland's heavy reliance on the potato made it particularly vulnerable to a crop failure. When the blight struck, the country was ill-prepared to cope with the resulting food shortage. The famine had a devastating impact on the Irish people. Millions were left without a means of subsistence, and many were forced to turn to begging or crime to survive. The famine lasted for several years, from 1845 to 1852. During this time, millions of Irish people died of starvation or disease. The death toll was exacerbated by the British government's inadequate response to the crisis. The British government, which ruled Ireland at the time, was slow to act. It implemented policies that favored British landowners and farmers, leaving the Irish people to fend for themselves. As the famine deepened, millions of Irish people fled the country in search of a better life. They emigrated primarily to North America, where they faced a harsh and uncertain future. The Great Irish Famine had a profound impact on the Irish diaspora. Irish immigrants played a crucial role in the development of countries such as the United States and Canada. The Great Irish Famine is a dark chapter in Irish history. It left a lasting legacy of poverty, suffering, and emigration. The famine also shaped the Irish identity. It fostered a sense of national pride and resilience, and it helped to forge a strong connection between the Irish people and their diaspora. The Belgian Congo, in the heart of Africa, a vast and unexplored territory, was about to become the scene of one of the most horrific atrocities in human history. The Belgian Congo, ruled by King Leopold II of Belgium, was a land of unimaginable suffering and exploitation. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, King Leopold II was granted control over the Congo Free State. He presented himself as a humanitarian, promising to end the slave trade and bring civilization to the region. However, Leopold's true intentions were far more sinister. He saw the Congo as a personal fiefdom, a place where he could amass wealth through the exploitation of its natural resources. The Congo Free State was rich in natural resources, particularly rubber. Leopold forced the Congolese people to work on rubber plantations, using brutal and inhumane methods. Congolese workers were subjected to a system of forced labor known as the rubber system. They were given quotas to meet, and failure to do so resulted in severe punishment. Leopold's regime was characterized by violence and oppression. One of the most common forms of punishment inflicted on Congolese workers was mutilation. Victims had their hands, feet, or other limbs severed as a deterrent to others. Torture was also widely used. Victims were beaten, burned, and subjected to other forms of physical and psychological abuse, in addition to individual acts of violence. The Belgian colonial authorities also organized mass killings of Congolese people. Villages were burned, and entire communities were wiped out. The violence was often calculated and systematic. The Belgian government tried to intimidate the Congolese. The violence was often calculated and systematic. The Belgian government tried to intimidate the Congolese. The Belgian colonial authorities established a system of forced labor that was designed to maximize profit while minimizing costs. Congolese workers were treated as less than human, and their suffering was seen as acceptable collateral damage. The Belgian colonial army, known as the Force Publique, was responsible for enforcing Leopold's will. The Force Publique was composed primarily of Congolese soldiers, who were often forced into service under threat of violence. The Force Publique was notorious for its brutality. Soldiers were given quotas to meet, and they were often rewarded for the number of hands they could collect as evidence of their victims. The atrocities committed in the Congo Free State eventually came to the attention of the international community. Investigative journalists and human rights activists exposed the horrors of Leopold's regime. In the face of growing public outrage, Leopold was forced to relinquish control of the Congo Free State in 1908. The Belgian government took over the colony, but the legacy of Leopold's reign continued to haunt the country for decades to come. The Belgian Congo was a tragedy of immense proportions. Millions of Congolese people died as a result of Leopold's brutal rule. The country was left devastated, both economically and socially. The legacy of the Belgian Congo continues to be felt today. The country is still grappling with the consequences of its colonial past. However, the Congolese people have shown remarkable resilience and determination to rebuild their nation. The Chernobyl disaster. On April 26, 1986, a nuclear nightmare unfolded in the heart of the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in the Ukrainian town of Pripyat, experienced a catastrophic explosion that released a massive plume of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The Chernobyl disaster was the result of a series of human errors and design flaws in the reactor. A poorly conducted experiment, combined with inadequate safety procedures, led to a power surge that caused the reactor to overheat and explode. The explosion released a vast cloud of radioactive material, including isotopes of iodine, cesium, and plutonium. This radioactive cloud was carried by the wind, spreading contamination across large swaths of Europe. The town of Pripyat, located just 3 kilometers from the power plant, was evacuated within hours of the accident. Approximately 50,000 people were forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind their belongings and loved ones. The evacuation was chaotic and disorganized. Many residents were not fully informed about the dangers of radiation, and many left without essential supplies. In the aftermath of the accident, thousands of people were mobilized to contain the radioactive fallout. These workers, known as liquidators, were exposed to high levels of radiation as they worked to clean up the contaminated site. The liquidators faced immense risks to their health. Many suffered from radiation sickness and other health problems. Their sacrifice was immense, but their efforts helped to prevent further spread of the radioactive material. The area around the Chernobyl power plant was declared a no-go zone, known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This zone was contaminated with radioactive material, making it uninhabitable for decades to come. The Chernobyl disaster had a devastating impact on the health of millions of people. Radiation sickness, cancer, and other health problems have been linked to the accident. The long-term health consequences of the Chernobyl disaster are still being studied. It is estimated that millions of people were exposed to radioactive material, and the full extent of the damage may not be known for years to come. The Chernobyl disaster was a global catastrophe. The Soviet Union initially downplayed the severity of the accident, but international pressure forced them to admit the full extent of the damage. The international community provided significant aid to the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the disaster. Countries sent medical supplies, food, and other assistance. The Chernobyl disaster is a stark reminder of the dangers of nuclear power. It is a testament to the human cost of technological advancements. The Chernobyl sarcophagus, a massive structure built to contain the radioactive reactor, stands as a symbol of the disaster. It is a reminder of the need for safety and vigilance.